As we commence the launch of GAR 2019, let me welcome to the stage Ambassador Khan, the permanent representative of Fiji to the United Nations and international organisations in Geneva, the special representative to the Secretary-General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Ms. Mami Mitsuturi, and Aroma Ravi, the Director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. The floor is yours.
Excellencies, delegates, media representatives, ladies and gentlemen, we are now about to start the session. If you could take your seats. I am very pleased to welcome you to the launch of the 2019 Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, popularly known as the GAR. I would like to extend a warm welcome to the Special Representative of the Secretary-General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Ms. Mami Mitsuturi, and Professor Aroma Ravi, Director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements and one of the coordinating lead authors of the 2018 IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. The GAR that we are launching today is the 5th edition of the report, which has established itself as the leading publication on disaster risk reduction and the one that has done the most to broaden our understanding of how disaster risk is created. It has benefited from the insight and experience of the world's leading thinkers and writers on disaster risk reduction over the last decade. Its first edition was published in 2009, so today we are also celebrating its 10th anniversary. 6 years before the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the 2009 GAR published a 20-point plan to reduce risk, and the first recommendation was to accelerate efforts to avoid dangerous climate change by agreeing an effective multilateral framework to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and policies for sustainable carbon budgeting. Unfortunately, greenhouse gas emissions have only continued to rise year after year, despite the Paris Agreement. It is now obvious that adaptation to climate change must be a key element in national and local strategies for disaster risk reduction. As the 2019 GAR conveys, the risk landscape has changed dramatically over the last decade, and not simply because of climate change. New risks and correlations between risks are emerging in a way that we have not previously anticipated. We are fast approaching the point where we may not be able to mitigate or repair impacts from cascading and systemic risk in our global systems. With increasing complexity and the interaction of human, economic, and political systems within ecological systems, risk is becoming increasingly systemic, and this calls into question our efforts to date to manage disaster risk. GAR 2019 challenges us to think in new ways about disaster risk management, to think of the plurality of risk rather than simply addressing the threats posed by individual hazards. A fundamental re-examination of how to deal with risk is essential. We need timely interventions to effectively protect those groups who are most at risk, with special emphasis on those living in low-income countries and small island developing states. Decades-old projections about climate change have come true much sooner than we expected. New evidence on climate change has come to light in the 2018 IPCC report, and it was a special report which was not available to us when the Sendai framework was agreed. Given the threat that climate change poses to humanity, there is a need to take a more integrated approach to adapting to and reducing risk from climate change, along with shorter-term risks from natural and man-made hazards. In general, assistance for disaster response, reconstruction, rehabilitation and recovery dominates at the expense of funding dedicated to understanding and reducing disaster risk. Evidence suggests that countries continue to underinvest in risk reduction and mitigation due to short-term thinking on the cost-benefit considerations. This edition of the GAR is the first to attempt to collect and analyze the early data provided by UN member states using the Sendai Framework Monitor. This effort has got off to a respectable start, but the momentum must continue to build if we are to reach the critical mass of data necessary to guide our understanding on the links between resilience and efforts to reduce vulnerability and exposure. To date, 56 countries have reported on their progress in achieving Target E of the Sendai Framework target, which sets a deadline of 2020 for national and local strategies to be in place to reduce disaster losses. These strategies are the foundation for the achievement of the 2030 targets on reducing loss of life, numbers of people affected, economic loss, and damage to critical infrastructure. They are also important to the overall achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Progress on eradicating poverty and hunger will be delayed if we do not improve resilience to disasters in low and middle-income countries. The GAR 2019 lays out all the arguments for doing so in an urgent and effective manner. With that, I would now like to give the floor to the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary-General for Disaster Risk Reduction, Ms. Mami Mizutori, to present on the key findings of GAR 19. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Khan. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ravi, time is running out for a world at risk. We are 4 years into the implementation phase of the Sendai Framework. We have just 11 years left to deliver what we all agreed in Sendai was imperative, that is, to move towards a world more free of risk, where resilient, equitable, and sustainable development can be made real. We are launching this 5th edition of the United Nations Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, or as we call it, GAR 2019, at a time of heightened global urgency. At no point in human history have we faced such an array of both familiar and unfamiliar risks interacting in a hyper-connected, rapidly changing world. Threats that were once considered inconceivable no longer are. Nonlinear change is a reality, and undermining social, environmental, and economic efforts to realize sustainable development. Change is occurring more quickly and surprisingly than previously thought possible, and we have learned that we can no longer use the past as a reliable indicator of the future. The GAR is known for breaking new ground on risk, challenging prevailing norms and provoking us all to re-examine our behavior, our choices. Whilst disaster risk has been the point of departure, it is clear that in an increasingly connected world, nothing about risk is siloed. We cannot afford to be narrow in our definition nor address of risk. Correspondingly, GAR 19 moves beyond disaster risk to consider the pluralistic nature of risk in multiple dimensions, at multiple scales, and with multiple impacts. It provides an update on how we, as governments, as communities, and as individuals, understand our relationship with risk and its reduction. It provides the first update on how governments are doing in relation to the 7 targets of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, as Ambassador Khan has just explained. the Global Guide to Understanding and Dealing with Risk, with special emphasis on the 2020 targetee, substantially increased the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. Extreme changes in planetary and socio-ecological systems are happening now. We no longer have the luxury of procrastination. If we continue living in this way, engaging with each other and the planet in the way we do, then our very survival as a species is in doubt. The responsibility to deal with risk is both collective and an individual one. So what does the GAR 2019 help us understand about what we know about risk, what we do not know about risk, and what we should do about it? Surprise is the new norm. The world faces new, emerging, and much larger threats than ever before, linked at least partly to climate change, environmental degradation, rapid urbanization. Change does not happen in silos or in straight lines. The choices we make are creating new, emerging, and larger risks. We must anticipate and allow room to deal with surprise, and non-linear change with flexibility and nimbleness is our strategies and plans. We need adaptive, anticipatory planning frameworks. We must be able to make real-time adjustments that anticipate and respond to change when pursuing economic activity and sustainable development. Second, risk is growing in a shrinking world. With increasing complexity and interaction of human, economic, and political systems, risk is also becoming increasingly systemic. Think of emerging NatTech disasters, where, for example, an extreme weather event realizes a hidden technological risk, causing a power grid to malfunction, which in turn has cascading impacts on the business community, critical infrastructure, and basic services. This means the era of hazard risk reduction is over. We need to move away from working on distinct areas of risks in disconnected silos. This is critical at national government level. National planning bodies with representation from all sectors must be convened to develop national disaster risk strategies that assume an all-of-state institutional approach to risk reduction. Third, risk is complex. Let's deal with it. Understanding risk means understanding what we know and being honest about what we do not know. We must push back against reductive concept, or headline titles that seek to ignore the systemic and cascading nature of risk. We must push back approaches that look at risk outside of their socio-ecological and socio-economic contexts. We need to adopt a pragmatic, pluralistic approach that studies risk phenomena at a variety of levels. Our research methodologies need to work in a transdisciplinary manner. Next, we know that there is a high cost to vulnerability. Disaster impacts are increasingly deadly, destructive, and costly, and they disproportionately affect the most vulnerable segments of the world's population. Exposure to disaster risk is on the rise. Unplanned urbanization is creating risk at an unparalleled rate, particularly in low and middle-income countries. Structural vulnerability keeps people living on marginal lands and in poor housing, exposed to earthquakes, landslides, floods, storms, droughts, and heat waves. We are witnessing severe inequalities of burden sharing between low and high-income countries. The poorest bear the highest toll of disasters, with asset and human losses generally higher in countries that have the least capacity to prevent the creation of risk or to mitigate and respond to shocks. We must prioritize interventions that build resilience in people or groups whose vulnerability profiles make them more susceptible to disaster risk. We must invest in human capital to enable risk-informed choices, empowering the vulnerables as drivers of change. And finally, nothing undermines development like a disaster. We have been unable to move away from a vicious cycle of disaster, respond, rebuild, and disaster, respond, rebuild. It repeats. Risk generated by the interaction of complex human and natural systems, amplified by changes in climate change, is reversing efforts to achieve the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And development assistance for risk reduction has been highly volatile and marginal and dwarfed by financing for disaster response. It is quite simple. Development must be risk-informed to create sustainable change. As a practical framework for dealing with risk, the Sendai Framework is the connecting tissue for the post-2015 international agreements. It makes the logical connections between reducing risk and building resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, GA 2019 represents a major step towards a 21st century view of risk and its reduction, an understanding that is imperative in our collective efforts to craft a sustainable future. It is my sincere hope that this global assessment report will contribute to the growing demand for change that is evident across the world. While governments must incentivize and lead risk reduction, we as individuals must own the consequences of our choices, our decisions, and the risks that we create, propagate or prevent, and reduce. The urgency is evident, self-explanatory and undeniable. It demands much greater ambitions around the speed and magnitude of the changes the global community needs to make, changes that must be proportionate to the scale of threat. Today, I call on governments and all stakeholders to recognize the part you must play now, so that together we can move towards the realization of the outcome, goals, and targets of the Sendai Framework in the 2030 Agenda for the good of the planet and all humanity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Special Representative Mizutori. And I now give the floor to Professor Aruma Revi of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador SRSG. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues who've been part of this struggle, I guess, for the last 2 or 3 decades. I'm very glad and honored to be here, partially to represent the community that's helped build the GAR over the last 10 years, but also possibly because I've had the fortunate opportunity of being part of the IPCC process for the 2 last cycles and helped write the 1.5C report that kind of shocked the world when we released it last year in October. So I'm known for being blunt. I'll try not to disappoint you. So we are firmly now in the Anthropocene. What does that mean? That means human actions and choices over the last 50 or 70 years that the UN has been here has led to a world in which we are the greatest threat to ourselves. And we can see this in New York, in Geneva, and all the conventions that we have, and also to the planet. And the planet, unfortunately for ourselves, is biting back. And I think that's what this whole debate, this engagement, and what I hope you'll be able to bring to us with both, of course, GAR 2019 and the actions relating to it are important. So what's the evidence for that? The most striking evidence, I think, came from IPBES just a few days ago when we're talking about 1 million species at the edge of extinction. What does that mean? That means the basis of life, and hence the basis of our life, is falling apart. If ecosystem services fall apart, it doesn't matter which part of the world you are. We did this in the IPCC report that we released in 2014 when I examined some of the largest cities in the world. It doesn't matter whether you're in New York or London or you're sitting in Durban. Once the ecosystem services start falling apart, you cannot protect yourself. It's just a question of time before your water systems, your energy systems, your food systems start falling apart. So that's, I think, the immediate wake-up call. And then last year in October, in the 1.5C report, what we said is, we have a generation to halt the overshoot over 1.5, which is incidentally now the new guardrail. It's not 2 as we dealt with 4 or 5 years ago. 1.5 is clearly a very critical and significant question, especially from those who come from the global south, from the SIDS, from other countries that are experiencing this in real time. What that means is that we have to deal with a 75% emission reduction over the next 20 years or so, which effectively means that we have to transform the global economic system to reduce risk. In practical terms, as far as food security is concerned, something that we touch on in GARD 2019 in dealing with drought, we see a shift from about 40-odd million people who are at risk at 1.5 to about 400 million people at risk at 2 degrees elevation of temperature. So this is not a linear change, it's a highly non-linear change. So every 0.1 degree is going to address and fuel the processes of drought, of the kind of extreme events that we've seen, rainfall, flooding, and we heard the story from Mozambique most recently. The challenge for us, of course, is that the Paris Accord, and I speak very frankly here and on my own accord, is not the fast elevator to 1.5 or 2 degrees. The Paris Accord, because it's a bottom-up process, is the fast elevator to 2.9 to 3.3 degrees. And we actually do not know what the world will be like way beyond 2. It's sort of in the realm of science fiction. So what does that mean in practice? It means that the risk of overshoot on the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas side is significant. What does that mean? It means that we have to capture carbon. We actually don't know enough about capturing carbon, and the processes that we know about in terms of capturing carbon at the moment are going to lead to a whole range of risks and vulnerabilities in some of the most vulnerable places in the world, whether it's food security, water security, or soil security. And of course, all the new technologies that we have are just at the initial stage. I know that because we helped assess this. We assessed 48 different technical options in the 1.5 report. I was responsible for that chapter. So we're in a situation where there's great uncertainties, like the SRG, as RSG just said just now, of the nature of hazard risk. And we're in a world in which vulnerability is increasing dramatically. So we have a mix of the biodiversity debacle, the climate emergency, and an explosion of risk, along with our imperative that, as member states, we've agreed on in 2015 of implementing the SDGs over the next 11 years. That's the really interesting challenge that we have. And within that, of course, we know the global economy is in some trouble, growth is slowing, jobs are in serious trouble, there's a new round of trade wars. But more important, as far as vulnerability is concerned, which underlies risk, inequality is now at astonishing levels across many parts of the world. Poverty is, of course, very large, especially in countries, in the global south, like many of us come from, and it will grow as an impact of climate and global environmental change. So what is the existential opportunity before us? We have to try and bring together, I would say, 5 critical agendas. And we know that. The SDGs, the larger framing, the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, the new urban agenda that gives us a really interesting opportunity to transform cities and infrastructure, which is driving much of this growth and also the risk. And of course, the financing, which in some senses is not very well spoken of, at least in my opinion, in the Addis Ababa agenda that's there. And we have to do this in under 4,000 days, because that's all we have now between now and 2030. So it's fairly obvious to those of us who are working on these questions and trying to bring it together that this cannot only involve 193 odd member states who are in the room here today. It requires a new form of partnership that embraces everybody from local governments, which are critical in terms of implementation, enterprise sector, civil society, the knowledge sector, and most important, citizens. We cannot hope to actually achieve this, and I think that's, in my experience of looking at how the Hyogo and the Sendai processes have worked very effectively, it's a bottom-up processes that are giving us the opportunity to actually enable implementation at scale, at the kind of speed and scale that we're required to do this. Of course, to enable that to happen, we require a whole range of enabling conditions. The challenge before us is that if we had started this process effectively at the time of Rio 25 years ago, we could have chosen between many of these options. What 1.5 and the GAR are telling us is that we have no opportunity now to actually deal with all of these things in separate boxes. We have to bring together the entire agenda, and we have to simultaneously implement it. Otherwise, the impacts and the pain that the most vulnerable will face is most significant. So in that, what are the 3 or 4 most important things? The most important, of course, is the question of governance. We have to be able to deal with both the top-down and the bottom-up and bring them together. Within that, my own experience speaks to the fact of the centrality of local governments, cities and regions and making this possible. But without that, in some senses, it will almost be impossible. We have to redirect the global economy. And that, I think, is one of the most difficult conversations that we have to have in the run-up through the years to UNGA and, of course, the SG Summit in September. Because unless we're able to address the redirection within national economies and between them, of bringing the resources, as we've said again and again, it's not the question of the billions anymore. It is really the question of the trillions. And we know that if we do not invest now, the costs of doing this are going to be so significant that neither will we be able to achieve the SDGs, nor will we be able to contain the kind of impacts that we see, the scale of migration and changes that we expect to see in the long run. But finally, I think the real issue for us, especially for the most vulnerable countries, is the question of healing and transforming the social fabric. Vulnerability and exclusion are at the heart of the challenge. At some senses, because of climate and other imperatives, we cannot actually do much about the hazards, at least in the short run. The exposure is there in most places because there's so many of us, and poor people and vulnerable people live in the most exposed areas. So the thing that you can change is actually vulnerability. Whether it's exclusion because of gender or race or caste or community, that is what we can change. And we know that that is socially constructed. And that is something that collectively in this new partnership we can actually change. So to leave you with at least one simple idea, it's not only the question of not leaving anyone behind. It's not only the question of not leaving anyone behind. It's also the question of not leaving any place behind. Internationally, the SIDS, LDCs, within countries, the most vulnerable regions, but critically, the idea of not leaving any ecosystem behind, because it's a connection between the ecosystem, the places, and the people that help us to be able to bring this sort of resilience dividend together. I mean, the hope that we have, of course, is because there are 8 billion of us, and we just heard the 1.8 billion young people who are there and are really raring to make the change. They have access to technology. We have really provided them an opportunity to learn. And of course, the world does have an immense amount of wealth and political will that we demonstrated in 2015 to actually make this possible. So I guess I commend this agenda to you. We're looking at, you're really rising to the occasion and trying to accelerate both ambition and implementation. Thank you very much.
So this brings us to the conclusion of this event. I would like to thank the SRSG and Professor Revi and all of you for your participation. And for those of you who wish to learn more about the Global Assessment Report 2019, I invite you to join the working session dedicated to this subject, which is taking place this afternoon from 14:30 to 1600 in room 3. This meeting is now concluded. Thank you very much indeed.